So quick intros. Kaitlyn Knopp is the founder and CEO of Pequity. She is a Xoogler and former head of global compensation at Instacart and Cruise. Just to say a little bit about Pequity, it's a compensation service and software that optimizes pay philosophy management, pay transparency, compensation cycles, and more. And you can learn more about her company at pequity.com. The next person is Terry O'Connor. Terry is founder of The Brash. She's also my partner in helping me put on these personal finance series conversations. She is a Xoogler. She's a former Wall Street investment advisor. She's also a former director of global technical recruiting and go-to-market executive recruiting at Databricks. So she comes at this conversation from the recruiting lens. She also just cares really deeply about sharing her practical knowledge of how to use financial decisions to inform your career decisions and so on and so forth. So again, another expert in the room. I am your moderator, Steph Lau. Are you guys ready to have a conversation?
Ready.
All right. Well, I will start it off with one thing, right? Which is I'd love to just kick it off by framing, what are you seeing right now in the industry, right? Like in terms of like the topic of compensation. I think we're in a really interesting time right now in that, companies have done lots of layoffs. There's a big talent pool out there, right? To be frank, some people are taking roles maybe that are junior to what they are used to taking or what they would have hoped. And so there's a lot of nuance here, right? And I know I asked a really heavy and loaded question, but I'd love for you guys to start there and sort of what you're observing in the market.
Absolutely. You want to go first, Terry, or?
Well, Kaitlyn, hey, I'd love for you to go. It's really good to anchor in data. And I think Kaitlyn is pretty much the expert in the data space and what she's seeing. I'll add Kaitlyn to whatever you share, but I'd love for you to take it away there, if that's okay.
Yeah, just always, I know I can wax on philosophically, so
yeah,
pause me if you need to. Excited to have this group here. I just want to say, first off, there's always a bit of an elephant in the room, especially I think as like women in the space, where you don't want to say like, hey, it is harder for us. There's like obstacles that we have to overcome. Because I think that sometimes it feels like you're playing the victim card, and I think all of us are very strong and we're very elevated in our careers, and we don't want to play those cards. And I don't necessarily think of it as a victimhood. I think it's just the cards that are handed to us that we need to learn how to play with. So if I come off a little spicy or I say things that are like, oh, like we don't really talk about that, that's okay. I probably intended it, but I just want to say thank you all for joining first. And, Steph, to your question on like what's happening in the market, I started Pequity in 2019, right before the pandemic. Prior to that, I came from the Google Comp and Ben's team, where we had all the data in the world, all the resources in the world. We worked with Terry and her team. Went on to cruise automation, working with General Motors, also lots of budgets and data that I had to build out systems from. Instacart, same thing. I did a bunch of consulting across the space. And I can very clearly say from that to the pandemic time, it was a very different time. What we saw was mass valuations of these startups that, interestingly, inverse to what we're seeing right now, meant that people were hiring more junior talent into roles that they were not qualified for. And so there was this talent war, as we all know. I saw, new grads getting manager roles, and there's people with 5 years experience being VPs and directors, and the valuations on their equity packages were enormous. And the interesting thing that is kind of ignored by it's not ignored, but it's acknowledged, but it's behind the scenes, is that when startups or these smaller companies go through these iterations like they do, bigger companies like the Googles, the Metas, the Amazons of the world, they have to respond, because it's not that you can just ignore it. There is some reality that they're responding to. And so that influence did impact these larger companies. They were hiring also more aggressively. They were leveling more aggressively. And we could see that in the data. Like equity packages were soaring. Cash packages, even at early stage startups, were actually mirroring what we call market comps. So things of a typical large company. And then that ended. As you all saw, there was mass layoffs. The funding dried up. The valuations for these startups started to plummet. And interestingly, the way that I've been framing this with a lot of companies that we still consult with, is there's been two forces at work here. One is the drying up of capital, the other is AI. And so for the drying up of capital, people have had to cut heads. And when we do cut heads, the activity is looking at, okay, well, I'm paying back to pandemic days. If I'm paying 500K for a new grad to do a director role, I could use that 500K to actually get someone with 15 years of experience. And so there's a lot of that shift that was happening. And then on the other side of the spectrum, AI was actually eliminating a lot of new grad roles. I was talking with Steph and Terry about this on our last call, but behind the scenes for a lot of my friends who are in the recruiting space, they told me that when ChatGPT first came out, many campus recruiters had their events canceled, their budgets taken back, because most of these companies said, we're going to use AI to fill these roles. We think that it'll be fine. And it was the large companies doing it. And so it created this weird compression for compensation where it's just fewer roles, both at the top and the bottom. Equity valuations we have consistently seen month over month have been steadily falling by like 30%. And so now we have all of this talent that's more available. We have AI taking on the junior tasks, which is kind of compressing this junior talent up into higher levels. Like they have to be skilled, they have to get up to these levels to be hired. And I don't know what the ultimate reset will be en masse because it's probably company by company, depending on the talent they had and what they laid off and how they use AI. And there's so many strategies. But I think we are all feeling these waves, this like ripple effect of all of these changes happening in a very condensed period of time. And it does change the way that we look at the data, the leveling, like how do we approach pay structures, what can we do? And I'm happy to go into more specifics, but I do want to own that if you guys feel like it's chaos right now, it is. Even internally at our companies, they recognize it's chaos. The packages are smaller. The senior leadership levels are fewer. And because of that, you have to be very strategic about the way you have these conversations. And to Terry's point, I do think data is good, but knowing how to marry the data with also the human empathy side, even though we're sometimes discouraged from that, I can tell you, we can share war stories about the crazy negotiations people have used on me and it works. Like it ultimately does work. And I'm the person at these companies who sits behind the scenes with the Terry. Terry's usually advocating to my team, right? Terry, like, I have this candidate, this is what's going on. We have to have them. And my team is like the scientist in the background trying to make this person fit the puzzle of all the other pay grades and people at the company. So I'm actually excited, Terry, to hear your side as well, because what we're excited about this conversation is hopefully giving you the science of the compensation side and like why that matters, but also giving you the science of the recruiting side and what Terry's dealing with and how she helps her candidates navigate the internal architectures that my team might build. So that's like the broad level stuff that we're seeing, a lot of releveling, a lot of collapsing of equity valuations, a lot of no junior talent out there, and always happy to answer questions on that too.
Kaitlyn, this is great. And, to your point about the data, but also the leveling and also having empathy, I think as a recruiter, managing recruiting process for new grads, that's over my span at Google. And then as time went on, helping more senior level candidates, directors, and then executives, the leveling piece is definitely always a topic of conversation. And we're trained as recruiters. If I put my recruiter hat on, we're trained not to actually have that conversation. We're really trained to say, do you like the role? And how are you going to make an impact? And talk about all the other benefits outside of, because compensation is, as Kaitlyn will attest to, it's not just your cash, your bonus, your stock, your salary, though that's very important. Cash flow is important and cash is king. And there's a recent article on that I can talk about in a little bit as far as where you get the data. But there are other pieces of the compensation package that are important. And then I always ask, is it level that's important? Is it title that's important? Or what are your must-haves and nice-to-haves? I think we need to, even as candidates, really talk about, well, when we're asking about level, what are we asking for? And level is different in different companies. And I'm just seeing, Kaitlyn, a lot of the chat, there's people talking about leveling. And to your point of, hey, we're being asked to take jobs that are at a lower level. But that's kind of what we're talking about, the chaotic reset. Well, is it really a lower level or were we leveled too high? But I also will contest as women, sometimes we were under leveled. I think that's absolutely true. and I know talking to Kaitlyn and Steph about what pay equity does too, how do companies try to help manage that pay gap and automate it, which is directly related to leveling. So I know I just said a lot of different things based on the chat, adding to what Kaitlyn is saying. I think the leveling is important, but there are other aspects of the compensation package to consider as well. But really understand now cash is the most important thing to candidates because people got burned by, equity and in joining startups and that equity not happening, or, the market not, working in their favor. But any thoughts on, Kaitlyn, what you're seeing companies and even candidates focusing on more as far as compensation and the need for cash?
I mean, cash, I think everyone is feeling the resets of these companies. And we're all selfishly rational beings, right? And so we all recognize there's a lot of candidates out there who recognize my equity valuation is going down. So the highest value that I can get from this right now is now. And they want to lock it in. So they want to lock it into some sort of cash component. And that is important. When we talk about compensation at different companies, the funny thing that, and I tell this when I go in and consult, there is no law that says I have to pay a software engineer 150K, right? There's no law out there that says that. There is a minimum wage law, and that is it. That is basically the only thing that I have to stick to. So all of these decisions that they're making around compensation, when they collect data, they're trying to hone in. And I had a CFO who used to say this to me. He was like, I want to pay a penny more for my engineers, but not a penny more. And it's this very real market force that they're operating against. So when you go to a company, and the reason I bring this up, and you say like, hey, I'm coming from a startup, I have this percentage of equity, I have this salary, this bonus. It's my job to figure out how does what you're bringing to the table compared to what we have constructed here. Because what I have constructed for my team as a compensation manager is basically the budget for the headcount. I have created a handshake agreement with my CFO. I've created these ranges. And the ranges for him are how he budgets. And it's what he gives to Terry's team. And he says, okay, we have this much money to spend on headcount. Here's how we divvy up the budget. We give more budget to our critical talent that the company cannot operate without. We'll give a little less budget to the people or the roles that are less business critical, right? Like they're not keep the lights on. But they still want to pay competitively. Most companies are not out there saying like, oh, let's like pay minimum wage to everyone who's not an engineer. They're trying to get to like the market competitive space, but give a smidge more to these engineers, especially in the tech space. And so I have to figure out if you come to me with this equity package that's not liquid or it's from a different business and that business is or is not doing well, how does that compare? And that's where the data can help you, can also hinder you. But it is key. And that's where those levels, that's where we're going to talk about titles, like all of those things are coalescing internally at that business. And the more that you can digest and understand what it means to that business, the more leverage you have in your discussions with the Terrys of the world. Because Terry's all, Terry, you're the translator, right? Like you're translating the needs of this candidate and what they're stating to get into the business when they do not have perfect information on what the business structures are.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kaitlyn, about being the translator. I would add the translator, back to the empathy piece, we really care about the candidate. Also, the comp expert, Kaitlyn, cares about the candidate. And I think sometimes we forget about that, even though when I'm talking to candidates, it's like, well, I need this and I want this particular compensation package. As a recruiter, most recruiters want to give you what you ask for. But we also have to go to the compensation team and they want to give you what you're asking for as long as it fits in within the market value. So the part about negotiation that I talk about, hey, we should ask, you could negotiate different parts of it. There also are limitations. And I think it's good for us to know that, but not to keep us from asking, but just to know, yeah, there are guardrails and they're not meant to, as Kaitlyn is saying, it's not because someone doesn't value your work or our work. It's just because you pay a certain amount for a certain amount of talent. So there's so many nuances about negotiating
Oh yeah.
and I have to negotiate with the compensation teams. Like that's part of my job. I'm not only the translator. If I have an offer, if a candidate has an offer and has a comp package, and then they got an offer from, Kaitlyn's and my company, well, that strengthens your offer if you have another offer. And that, I think that's, sort of tried and true. However, what's changed now in 2024,
Market.
yeah, most candidates don't have that bargaining power, but you still can ask.
I'd love for you guys to back up a sec because I feel like we entered a conversation with experts, which is true. I think real tactically something that is happening, right, is employers are starting to post the job ranges for these roles. And some of them are insane. They go from 75K to 300K, and you're like, what am I supposed to make of this, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe if one of you guys could talk us through maybe two questions related to this, right? One, why is this happening? What is that about, right? Two, I would love to know, like, okay, maybe if we're talking about total rewards, right, which is another concept that I'm going to throw in there. Kaitlyn can fill in the gaps there. If we're talking about total rewards, maybe the value does add up to that much. What are the components that people think about and that are negotiable, right, in a compensation negotiation conversation, right? So kind of two questions, yeah.
Yeah. Well, to share on the ranges, that is, if you see the wide ranges, that is an HR team thrashing in the middle of these new laws. So whenever I see those wide ranges, I generally know, one, that company probably doesn't have enough resources to accommodate this law. And two, they have very paranoid leaders. So what I mean by that is if they don't have like a person, like a recruiting ops person to manage their ranges, what we see is they dump these really wide ranges into their ranges to be compliant, because they probably do have a very sophisticated and complex internal job architecture, and they don't know how to actually get it loaded to their HRIS so that they can like accommodate it. Not a good excuse, by the way, but kudos for them trying to do something. Or for the paranoid leaders, and I run into this all the time with engineers, like if I put the range up, I'm not going to get the talent I want. And that's because of this concept that we call evergreen recs. Evergreen recs is when a team puts out an open, if for anyone doesn't know, it's an open requisition. They'll put out like software engineer, and there's no level on it because they just want the market at large to know that they want good engineering talent. And so they just hope that a really great principal engineer applies, maybe a couple senior. They just want everyone to kind of dump into this portal. But if you put out these ranges, they're worried that they're not going to get very senior people because they're going to self-select out. And so when I see these pay ranges, I think of it as a guidance to your median, like something that you can know about how teams are thinking about these ranges is they want to be realistic, but they want to capture the broad market. So I'm almost like, sometimes I just average the numbers. I'm like, okay, it's somewhere, this is probably the target of what I can do, but don't exclude yourself from the upper end on it. Like it really is a guiding force right now until we get more legislation that has teeth to these things, or until systems get better and companies are better resourced around this challenge. Those ranges are more guidance than anything. So unfortunately, it's not they're not useful. I do think that they are real data points. I think that they're just going to be very hazy. I don't know how you feel, if you agree with that or not, Terry.
No, I totally agree. And I would add, we talked about this a little bit, not only the ranges, are there for those reasons. You also know it's the job descriptions, the way they're written are also, they also encompass early career job. I'm exaggerating a little bit too, someone who's, in a more very senior level role. And it's usually like 3 or 4 jobs in one. And the reason why I think it's good to talk about this and to know is to say, okay, at least I know the job is there. Then it's for us as candidates and as experts in your field to say and be able to ask and use the job description as a talking point and saying, hey, I noticed, this is what the role is about. Can you share more about the role? Especially in the very beginning of the recruiting process, of course, or the interview process, because that also will help you be able to ask, well, what's the compensation package? It's like, okay, this posting is like 5 jobs in one, and it ranges from, $100 to $250,000. And so, to Kaitlyn's point, I kind of look at it as a conversation starter. And it also shows that no matter what your level is, that you're a leader, that you're looking at what's your future impact, and you're saying, hey, I want to work for this company. Here's all the things that you're saying that you need. Tell me more about it, about this specific job, and tell me exactly what the compensation package is for this, because I'd love to learn more.
And I realized, Steph, I didn't answer the one question around total rewards. I will state that most of the businesses, the only requirement for this pay transparency law is salary or cash. It won't include typically bonus. It's not going to include benefits. It's not going to include equity. It's optional if they include that. I think a lot of people are hesitant to put in the total rewards component because that in itself is a little nebulous. Like we've all been at Google. We probably all saw our Go Prosper pages or the total pay package systems that they put out there. And we struggled. We actually on the comp team had a lot of discussion about what is this? Because we had engineers, by the way, who, I don't know if you all remember this, but Google didn't have soda. And so we had engineers who would negotiate for soda stipends because they
Soda
were
like Coca-Cola,
Yeah.
Pepsi,
Fair enough.
hilarious.
Yeah.
they would come and they'd be like,
Yeah.
Facebook has soda and I drink like at least 3 sodas a day. So I need like at least $3,000 added to my pay package for a soda stipend. And we were like, do we put this in the total reward statement?
Wow.
But those are what people think about. And that's just an example, by the way, of an argument that actually worked at a place like Google, albeit back in the day. And you do have to think about total compensation and what you're going to get and what you won't get. But I do think the paramount side of this negotiation is going in. And there's a couple of factors when I negotiate, because a lot of people are like, well, Kaitlyn, like, how do you go in? And I will call out that as a compensation manager, it's hilarious. My last 2, I think it was Cruise was the last offer I got that I didn't have to comp my own offer. Like part of my negotiation is they're like, well, if you're so good at comp, make your offer, which is like such a twisted mind game to put on someone.
I love that though.
Yeah.
Hilarious.
But the way that I approach it, and I still do this with even candidates I bring into the company, is I say, I have levers at my disposal, right? And if you're a candidate coming in, you'd say, hey, you have levers at your disposal that I don't fully understand, right? And it could be around leveling, title, to Terry's point. You have total rewards. I don't know how your compensation is manifested or configured, but once I like to not give the number first, I like to say, hey, give me your best offer, tell me a reasonable range, let them present the first offer. And then I say, hey, I have to think about it, because you do want to give yourself a day to think, like actually think, like, is this in range of what I want? And then go back and say, listen, I'm so excited to work with you and the team. This offer fell short of some of my expectations. I know that I don't fully understand your pay package, so I want to give you the chance to explain it to me. But I also want to know if there's other levers at your disposal. Here are the areas I'd like to see improvement. And I like the structure of that conversation. And hopefully it's good for Terry, because the things that the recruiter needs to know, one, they need to know that you're flexible. If you come in and you're like, I need to have $1 million cash tomorrow, they're going to be like, I can't do that. I don't know if I can get this person. I cannot meet a really stiff, rigid requirement. If you do have a really stiff, rigid requirement, that's okay, but you just have to know that the recruiter might not be able to meet a very rigid ask. You also need to signal to them that you do want this role. Because for Terry, she's talking to a lot of people. She has a manager whose emotions she's managing. So you don't want to come in and be like, well, I wasn't really that interested anyways. And you'd be shocked at how hostile some candidates can get in negotiation, because it's uncomfortable, it's emotional. And so they bring that energy onto the call. And for Terry, she's paying attention to that energy, because the way that you handle conflict is how you're going to interact with the team. And she's responsible for finding a good fit for the team. So you don't want to present that to her. And then on top of it, giving some parameters, like saying, like, I'm flexible. I do want to work with the team. I want to work through this with you. Here are the areas that I was lacking. It gives you some room to guide around it without locking out some optionality, right? Like if you said, hey, I really expected this total package to be a little bit higher in cash comp. I know this is a little bit short. Is there anything you can do? And backing that with some data of your own. What I'm looking for when Terry comes to me as a compensation manager, I have to also defend my spend to my CFO. And if I go over budget, I have to defend that. And the things that I need to look at with her, if someone has a cash gap is what we call it. So let's say you have a bonus that you're starting in June, you're going to get paid a bonus end of year, and you're leaving half of your bonus on the table. That is a cash gap. That could be solved by a sign-on. If you came to Terry and you said, I'm vesting what I equate to 100K in equity every year, and I'm leaving 50K on the table this year, and I have another 100K next year that I'm not going to get, and that is a cash fall, it's a total compensation fall. That's also something that we're going to look into. Even saying things like, hey, like I have a bigger title and a bigger scope at this role, and you're taking away some of that. And for me, like that title does have an economic value. This is what it ties to. I need to have that reflected in my pay package. Those are all actually very logical, rational arguments that a compensation manager like myself can look at and be like, I'll of course have my defense. I have already in my head, I'm like, I know the things I would say back to Terry. But the more of those that you present, the more of those that I will be more amicable to opening up with Terry, because I can be like, okay, I get it. Like they have one rationale, they've signaled that they're flexible. I can do a couple of things, and then I can communicate to Terry, like, okay, we can do a sign-on. I can't give them more salary because that's going to go outside of their peers, but you could consider up-leveling them, or we can talk about giving them a retention bonus, which people do. People don't realize you can get retention bonuses in your offer. I'll give her, this person a retention bonus for next year. And I think the really important thing that I love about negotiations, I think you should always negotiate, is you're signaling to your team that you have these aspirations. You're lining yourself up for that next performance conversation, the next comp cycle, for them to know, okay, like they are leaving something on the table that I probably will have to bridge the gap on eventually. And the more friendly and the more emotionally tame that you come, I think that negotiations are just like a series of positive interactions. The more positive you can be with this team, the more likely you are to get it. And you don't have to come hard with a lot of data. I think having data for your own reassurance is helpful, but don't feel like you have to present a lot of numbers. I think it's just a general signaling of, we're on opposite sides of the tables. I want to get on the same side of the table as you. Whatever we can do to bridge that gap, I'm willing to figure it out, but you need to come back to me with something better. Like that's how I think about all these, but I'm curious, Terry, how you think.
Kaitlyn, I not to repeat everything, I concur. Everything you said resonates. In fact, as you're talking, I have my recruiter hat on, and I felt like I was having a conversation with you. And to your point, it's a conversation. I'm on the same side of the table with you because I'm the translator. I have the candidate, and if everyone as a candidate gives the information to me as the recruiter in the way Kaitlyn is proposing, which is how I propose it as well, I take that and have a conversation. And I think that that's how we have to enter negotiation. It's positive. You said it, it's a positive, chain of conversations and discussions. And it also is part of the interview process. Kaitlyn, you really said it, because I do, when I'm talking to someone, if something comes up where it isn't very positive discussion or a lot of pushback, then as the recruiter, and as any person would start questioning it. So, but I love this that, and I think it's really nice for people to see what goes on behind the scenes. Like we're partners, you and I, and we want to hire this person. You give me options as a recruiter, like, okay, here's what you're proposing. I can work with you on these two things, but not on this. And that's really how it works.
Yes.
Can I ask a question? What you guys just said is really weird for me to hear as a candidate, because you're in this position of power. I'm scared as hell that if I come in and actually ask for what I want, you're going to rescind the offer, right? Because there's some other candidate this is how I feel, right? But you're going to rescind the offer because this is, there's some other candidate waiting in the wings. There's always a second choice, right? You met like 6 people and there's a 1 and a 2. To be quite frank, I have definitely been in a situation where I was actually someone's second choice at a startup, and they actually called me to give me an offer because their first choice candidate declined. I didn't pick up the phone for whatever reason. I called them back 15 minutes later, and they're like, oh my God, in that window of time, our first choice candidate actually called us back and took the offer. And I was like, oh my God, like what in the world is happening, right? And so, I mean, I'm putting that out there as like someone who has a lot of fear around asking for what I want and what I believe I'm worth, right? I kind of would love to hear, I guess maybe it's a statement, I don't know. I mean, love to hear reactions to kind of what I'm saying, but just acknowledge
Yeah.
how difficult it is as a woman sometimes to know that this is what I'm worth and to, negotiate for that.
Yeah, Steph, thanks for sharing. I mean, that's definitely from the heart. That is a, obviously a real life example. I'm sure many of us have had that. I've been in those situations too as a recruiter where, the first candidate walked away and then came back, or had to go to the second candidate. And that goes back to, what Kaitlyn and I are talking about, is having this empathy and understanding that candidates, and I think I see in the chat, like the candidates have no power. Candidates do have power. You as a candidate, you have the power to ask and know. And again, I'm speaking from my experience, by the way. I've always worked with great compensation teams. Google's the best that I've worked with. I mean, you're working with human beings, not companies. And these are real people who are trying to get you what you want. And when I have a candidate that's the finalist, my goal, because I'll tell you a little bit about how recruiters are metrics also. I'm metrics on closing a candidate. I have incentive to close a candidate. And so it's kind of, it is a balance of power, because a candidate has more power, I think, than you think. And power is a funny word, or more, I don't know, Kaitlyn, what would be a better word than power?
Well, like if you have gotten a manager to the point where they like you, like, because remember, me and Terry are not in charge of actually hiring. Like, Terry screens you for the first, but it's the manager and that committee who decides.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And they have way more power than us. Like they're
Yeah.
like,
So yeah, we're trying to give you power. In fact, I have just a funny thing from my recruiting experience. I always, in working at a company, you can't say this, but I always was hoping that a candidate was going to ask for more or ask to negotiate. That would, and I could never say, hey, can you ask for more in this package that we're offering? Or, hey, we have this much wiggle room. Can you come back with something? I could never do that. And I always wanted to. And I'm just saying that just from my point of view. Now I can. I can say, hey, ask, because you do have more, I think, agency. I think that's a better word. You have more agency over the negotiation process than you might think. But Kaitlyn is spot on. The power isn't with the hiring manager. I mean, ultimately, especially in startups, right? Even though there's a committee, and in my experience, hey, they have committees at smaller companies or at startups, but if the hiring manager disagrees even with the final outcome, they can not move forward with the candidate. So yeah.
It's crazy. No,
Anyway.
thank you both for taking a minute to answer that. Okay, let's switch gears. I'm going to turn off the recording. Thank you very much.